For 23 years, I devoted my life to raising my son Harold as a single mother, working double shifts just to give him every opportunity. When he married Delilah, I welcomed her with open arms, even giving them my life savings to buy their dream home. But the moment I was diagnosed with arthritis and could no longer work overtime, everything changed. Delilah started whispering behind my back, calling me useless, a drain on their finances. She had no idea that while she plotted to ship me off to the cheapest nursing home she could find, I was secretly recording every cruel word. What she also didn't know was that my late sister had left me something in her will, something that would turn their greed into the biggest mistake of their lives. This is the story of how my daughter-in-law's betrayal backfired spectacularly, and why you should never underestimate the quiet ones who've been planning their next move all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I always knew something had shifted in Delilah's attitude toward me, but I never imagined how deep her resentment truly ran until I started paying closer attention to the little things. For the first 3 years after Harold married her, life in their Maplewood Heights home had been relatively peaceful. I contributed my fair share, actually more than my fair share, to the household expenses, kept to my small bedroom on the second floor, and tried my best to give the newlyweds their space while still being available whenever they needed help. Delilah worked as a senior loan officer at First National Bank, a position that came with a decent salary and plenty of prestige in our small town of Brookfield. She'd often mention her colleagues, her important meetings, and the high-profile clients she worked with. Harold had landed a solid job as an IT specialist at the local hospital, making good money, but nothing compared to what Delilah pulled in. Together, they were doing well for themselves, or so it seemed on the surface. But I was the one who made their comfortable lifestyle truly possible. My job at Peterson Textile Manufacturing wasn't glamorous, but after 28 years on the factory floor, I'd worked my way up to floor supervisor. The overtime hours were brutal. Sometimes I'd pull 12-hour shifts, coming home with my hands stained from fabric dyes and my back aching from standing all day. But those extra hours meant an extra $200 to $2,500 per month, and every penny of that overtime went straight into their household account. I paid for groceries, utilities, insurance premiums, and even their car payments. When their dishwasher broke down, I bought the replacement. When they wanted to renovate the master bathroom, I covered the $8,000 cost without blinking. I told myself it was an investment in Harold's future, in the family legacy I was helping to build. After all, this was the son I'd raised alone since he was 3 years old, working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. The $47,000 I'd given them for the house down payment had been my entire life savings, money I'd scraped together over decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. I'd planned to use that money for my own retirement someday, maybe buy a small cottage somewhere quiet. But when Harold and Delilah found their dream house, a beautiful colonial with 4 bedrooms and a 2-car garage in the best neighborhood in town, I didn't hesitate. Family first, I told myself. This is what mothers do. Delilah had been so grateful back then, tears in her eyes as she hugged me tight. "I can't believe how generous you are," she'd whispered. "Harold is so lucky to have a mother like you. We both are." She'd even insisted on putting my name on some of the household documents, saying I was as much a part of this family as anyone. But that gratitude started to fade as the months turned into years. It began with small comments that I initially brushed off as harmless observations. "You know, Mom," Delilah would say. She'd started calling me Mom right after the wedding. "You work so much, you barely get to enjoy the house. Maybe you should think about slowing down a bit." At first, I thought she was being considerate, worried about my health and well-being. Then came the suggestions about my living space. "This house is really designed for a nuclear family," she mentioned one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. Not that we mind having you here, of course, but sometimes I wonder if you might be happier in a place that's more suited to your stage of life. When I asked what she meant, she quickly backtracked. Oh, nothing specific, just thinking out loud. The comments became more frequent after their second anniversary. Delilah would make observations about my routine, my belongings, my presence in common areas of the house. Maybe we should convert the spare room into Harold's home office, she'd suggest. You don't really need all that space anyway. Or, I saw this article about senior living communities that look absolutely lovely, much more social than staying home all day. I started noticing how she'd stiffen when I'd join them for their evening TV time, or how she'd exchange glances with Harold when I'd offer to help with household projects. The warm, "Good morning, Mom," greetings became perfunctory nods. The invitations to join them for dinner out stopped coming. Slowly but surely, I was being pushed to the margins of a tiny life I was financially supporting. Harold, bless him, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. He'd always been a bit naive when it came to reading social cues, more comfortable with computers than with complex human emotions. When I'd try to bring up Delilah's changing attitude, he'd wave it off. She's just stressed from work, he'd say. You know how demanding her job is. She doesn't mean anything by it. But I knew better. I'd been around long enough to recognize when someone was being managed out of a situation. Delilah was laying the groundwork for something, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. She'd become expert at phrasing her criticisms as concerns, her rejections as suggestions for my own benefit. I worry that you're not getting enough social interaction, she'd say, when what she really meant was that she wanted me out of her social spaces. The house that I'd helped them buy, the life that I'd helped them build, was slowly becoming a place where I felt like an unwelcome guest. But I kept paying my share, kept working those overtime hours, kept telling myself that this was just a rough patch that would smooth itself out once they settled into married life. After all, family was family, and I'd invested too much in Harold's happiness to give up now. Little did I know that Delilah's plans for me were far more calculated than I'd imagined, and that my growing suspicions were about to be confirmed in the most devastating way possible. The beginning of the end came on, a Tuesday morning in late September, when Dr. Martinez delivered the news that would change everything. I'd been experiencing increasing stiffness and pain in my hands and wrists for months, attributing it to the repetitive motions of my factory work. But when the pain became so severe that I could barely grip the machinery controls, I finally made an appointment. I'm afraid it's rheumatoid arthritis, Dr. Martinez said, showing me the x-rays and blood test results. It's progressed quite a bit, and given the nature of your work, we need to discuss some significant changes to your daily routine. He explained that the constant gripping, lifting, and repetitive motions of textile manufacturing were accelerating the joint damage. The overtime shifts that had been my financial lifeline were now medically impossible. How significant are we talking? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. No more than 40 hours per week, and that's pushing it. Ideally, you should be looking at 30 hours maximum, with frequent breaks and modified duties. The inflammation in your joints needs time to respond to treatment, and continuing at your current pace will only make things worse. I sat in that sterile office, staring at the pamphlets he'd given me about managing arthritis, and felt my world crashing down around me. Those overtime hours weren't just extra income. They were what made my contribution to Harold and Delilah's household meaningful. Without that extra $1,200 to $1,500 per month, I'd be bringing home barely $2,200. Still a contribution, but nowhere near the financial powerhouse I'd been. That evening, I gathered Harold and Delilah in the living room to break the news. Harold's face immediately filled with concern. Mom, are you going to be okay? Is there anything they can do for the pain? His questions focused on my well-being, my comfort, my health. Delilah's questions were different. So you'll be working fewer hours permanently? How much less money are we talking about? When I explained the financial impact, I watched her expression shift from concern to what I can only describe as calculation. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I suppose we'll need to adjust our budget accordingly." "I'm sorry," I said, feeling genuinely guilty for circumstances beyond my control. "I know this affects everyone, but the doctor was very clear about the restrictions." "Of course," Delilah replied, her voice taking on that carefully controlled tone I'd learned to recognize. "We'll figure it out. Family adapts, right?" But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I noticed her fingers drumming against the arm of her chair, a nervous habit she had when she was planning something. The changes started almost immediately. Within a week, Delilah had prepared a detailed household budget breakdown, complete with pie charts and expense categories. She called it a family meeting, but it felt more like a financial audit. "Now that our income situation has changed," she began, spreading papers across the dining room table, "we need to be more strategic about expenses." She'd calculated that my reduced contribution would create a monthly shortfall of approximately $1,400. The question is, how do we address this gap? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harold suggested they could cut back on some of their discretionary spending. Fewer dinner dates, maybe postponing the kitchen renovation they'd been planning. But Delilah had other ideas. "Actually, I've been thinking about this more holistically," she said, pulling out another set of documents. "Harold, your mother is 58 years old. In most families, parents her age are thinking about retirement, not supporting their adult children's households." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting, Delilah?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to consider whether this living arrangement still makes sense for everyone involved." She spoke in the same professional tone she probably used with difficult loan applicants. "You're dealing with health issues that are only going to get worse. We're young professionals trying to build our careers and start a family. Maybe we all need to think about environments that better suit our respective life stages." Harold looked confused. "Are you saying Mom should move out?" "I'm saying we should explore all our options," Delilah replied smoothly. "There are some wonderful senior communities in the area, places where your mother could get proper care for her arthritis, have social activities with people her own age, and not have to worry about contributing to household expenses she shouldn't be responsible for anyway." The way she said it made it sound like she was doing me a favor, but I recognized the underlying message. I was no longer financially valuable enough to justify my presence in their home. "I can still contribute," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It may be less than before, but I'm not destitute." "Oh, of course," Delilah said quickly. "But let's be realistic about what that contribution covers versus what it costs to accommodate an aging family member. There's wear and tear on the house, increased utility bills, food costs, and eventually there will be medical expenses and care needs. When you factor in everything, it might actually be more economical for everyone if you were in a place specifically designed for people with your needs." Harold was quiet throughout this exchange, and I could see him processing the financial logic of what his wife was saying. The son who used to tell me I worked too hard was now listening to arguments about why my reduced earning capacity made me a burden. "I think we should research some options," Delilah continued, pulling out printed pages from senior living websites, "just to see what's available. No pressure, of course, but it would be irresponsible not to consider all possibilities." As I looked at those brochures, Sunset Manor, Golden Years Community, Peaceful Pines Assisted Living, I realized that Delilah had been planning this conversation for some time. These weren't spontaneous suggestions. They were prepared talking points in a campaign to remove me from the home I'd helped them buy. That night, lying in my bed in the room that was apparently no longer really mine, I understood that my diagnosis had given Delilah the excuse she'd been waiting for. I was no longer the generous mother-in-law contributing to their success story. I was now the aging dependent threatening their financial goals and lifestyle aspirations. The battle lines had been drawn, though only one of us seemed to realize. We were at war. The research phase that Delilah had promised turned into something much more aggressive than I'd anticipated. Within days of our family meeting, she'd already scheduled tours at 3 different senior living facilities, made appointments with financial planners, and even contacted a real estate agent to get a market assessment on optimizing our living space. "I'm just being thorough," she explained when I questioned the sudden urgency. "These places have waiting lists, Nora. If we decide this is the right path, we need to get the process started early." It was the first time in years that she'd called me by my actual name instead of Mom, and the shift felt intentional. I was no longer family. I was a problem to be solved. Harold seemed uncomfortable with how quickly things were moving, but Delilah had a way of making her pushiness sound like efficiency. "Honey, your mother deserves the best care possible," she'd tell him. "We can't provide the specialized attention she's going to need as her arthritis progresses. These facilities have trained staff, physical therapy programs, social activities, designed for people her age." What she didn't mention was that the cheapest option she'd found, Sunset Manor, looked more like a warehouse for the elderly than a caring community. During our tour, I noticed the understaffed nursing station, the residents sitting alone in the common areas, and the overwhelming smell of disinfectant that couldn't quite mask less pleasant odors. But the monthly fee was only $2,800, which made it appealing to Delilah's budget-conscious mindset. "It's actually quite reasonable," she commented as we walked through the cramped studio apartments. "And look, they provide meals, so you wouldn't have to worry about cooking anymore." "I like cooking," I replied, but she waved off my objection. "At your age, with your arthritis, you shouldn't have to worry about standing over a stove. This would eliminate so much daily stress." The way she described it, you'd think she was offering me a vacation rather than warehousing me in a facility where these social activities consisted of bingo twice a week and a monthly birthday celebration in the cafeteria. But it was the private conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear that really opened my eyes to Delilah's true feelings. The first incident happened on a Thursday evening when I'd gone upstairs early, complaining of joint pain. I'd forgotten my arthritis medication downstairs and was heading back to get it when I heard Delilah's voice from the kitchen. "I'm telling." "You, Janet, it's becoming impossible," she was saying into her phone. "She's always here, always underfoot. And now with this arthritis situation, it's only going to get worse." I froze at the top of the stairs listening. No, Harold doesn't see it yet. He's still in denial about how much she's aged. But I can see what's coming. Doctor's appointments, physical therapy. Eventually, she'll need help with basic tasks. We're young professionals, not caregivers. There was a pause as she listened to whoever Janet was. Exactly. And the financial aspect is just the beginning. Do you know what it costs when someone really needs care? We could be looking at thousands per month. Plus the impact on our careers if we're constantly dealing with medical emergencies. Another pause. Well, I've been researching options. There are some decent places that aren't too expensive. The key is getting her to agree before she gets worse, and we're stuck with a more complicated situation. I crept back upstairs, my heart pounding. Delilah wasn't concerned about my well-being. She was concerned about the inconvenience I represented to her future plans. The next overheard conversation was even worse. I was in the laundry room folding clothes when Delilah came home from work, talking loudly on her cell phone as she entered through the garage. "No, Mom, you don't understand. How awkward it is," she was saying. "I can't have friends over because she's always there. Last week, Jennifer and Mark came for dinner, and she spent the whole time telling stories about Harold's childhood. It's like having a live-in historian who won't take a hint." She dumped her purse on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. And the thing is, she acts like she owns the place. Because she helped with the down payment, she thinks she has a say in everything. When we wanted to change the living room furniture, she had opinions. When we talked about renovating the kitchen, she wanted input. It's our house, not hers. I felt my chest tighten with anger and hurt. The down payment I'd provided wasn't just help. It was my entire life savings, money that had made their dream home possible. I know. Harold keeps saying we should be grateful, and I am grateful for what she did. But that was then, and this is now. She's becoming a burden, and someone needs to have the difficult conversation about what's realistic going forward. The word burden hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd contributed, I had become nothing more than a burden to be managed. But it was the conversation I overheard the following weekend that truly revealed the depth of Delilah's resentment and planning. Harold had gone to play golf with his college friends, leaving Delilah and me alone in the house. I was reading in my room when I heard her talking to someone on the phone in the living room below. "Listen, Sarah, I need to be strategic about this," she was saying. "If I push too hard, Harold will dig in his heels and defend his mother. But if I can frame it as what's best for her health and independence, he'll come around." There was a long pause as she listened. The arthritis diagnosis was actually perfect timing. Now I have a medical reason to suggest she needs specialized care. And the reduced income gives us a financial justification for restructuring the living arrangement. Another pause. Exactly. I've been documenting everything: her limitations, her increased need for help, the financial impact. If she resists, I'll have a paper trail showing why this is necessary. My blood ran cold. Delilah had been building a case against me, treating my health problems and financial contribution like evidence in a legal proceeding. The goal is to get her settled somewhere by Christmas. That gives us a few months to handle the transition gradually, and then we can start the new year with a clean slate. A clean slate. That's what my removal from their lives represented to her, not a painful family separation, but a fresh start free from the inconvenience of Harold's aging mother. I know it sounds harsh, but we're at a crucial point in our careers. Harold's up for a promotion. I'm being considered for the branch manager position. We can't afford to be distracted by elder care issues right now. As I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law reduce my life to a series of issues and distractions, I realized that the woman who had once called me the most generous mother-in-law anyone could ask for had been planning my exile for months. The gratitude, the appreciation, the family bonds I thought we'd built. It had all been performance, maintained only as long as I remained financially useful. Now that my usefulness had diminished, so had her tolerance for my presence in the life I'd helped them build. As I sat in my room that night, processing the cruel reality of Delilah's calculated campaign against me, my mind drifted back to the early days when Harold was just a little boy who needed his mother more than anything else in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same son I'd sacrificed everything for was now allowing his wife to treat me like discarded furniture. Harold was only 3 when his father, Michael, walked out on us. I still remember that awful Tuesday morning when I woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore. The responsibility is too much. You're better at this parenting thing than I'll ever be." Just like that, 26 years old with a toddler and a mortgage, I became a single mother with no warning and no backup plan. Those first few years were brutal. I was working as a receptionist at a dental office making barely $18,000 a year. After rent, utilities, daycare, and basic necessities, there was nothing left for emergencies. And with a small boy, emergencies were constant. When Harold got pneumonia at age 4, I had to choose between paying for his antibiotics or paying the electric bill. I chose the antibiotics and spent 3 days in a cold, dark apartment, bundling Harold in blankets and telling him we were camping indoors. When he started school, I took a second job cleaning offices at night. I'd drop Harold off at my neighbor Mrs. Patterson's house at 6 p.m., work until midnight scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans, then pick him up and carry him home sleeping. Some nights, I'd fall asleep at the kitchen table grading his homework with him, exhausted from 18-hour days, but determined to be present for every aspect of his education. The other mothers at school events looked at me differently. The single mom who showed up in her cleaning uniform because she'd come straight from work, who brought homemade cookies to bake sales because she couldn't afford the fancy store-bought ones the other families contributed. But Harold never seemed to notice or care. He'd run to me with the same enthusiasm whether I was wearing business clothes or coveralls stained with industrial cleaner. When Harold was 8, I finally got the job at Peterson Textile Manufacturing. The pay was better, $28,000 to start, but the work was physically demanding. I spent 10 hours a day on my feet, operating heavy machinery in a hot, loud factory environment. My hands were constantly stained with fabric dyes, my back ached from leaning over cutting tables, and the noise was so constant that I'd come home with ringing in my ears. But it was steady work with good benefits, and for the first time since Michael left, I could breathe a little easier financially. I could afford to buy Harold new clothes instead of thrift store finds. I could pay for his participation in school sports. When he wanted to take piano lessons, I worked overtime every Saturday for 6 months to pay for them. The teenage years brought new challenges and expenses. Harold was a bright kid, but he struggled with confidence issues, partly, I think, because he'd internalized some shame about our financial situation. When his friends' families went on vacation to Florida or bought new cars, Harold would come home quiet and withdrawn. I'd find him staring out his bedroom window, and I knew he was wondering why his life looked so different from his classmates. That's when I started working double shifts whenever possible. Every overtime hour meant an extra $18, and I'd take every opportunity the factory offered. During the busy seasons, I'd work 6 12-hour days per week, coming home exhausted but knowing that each paycheck brought us closer to giving Harold opportunities I'd never had. When Harold was 16, he came home from school one day and announced that he wanted to go to college. "I want to study computer science, Mom. I've been researching programs, and there are some really good schools that offer degrees in information technology." I was thrilled that he had academic ambitions, but terrified about the financial reality. State college tuition was $8,000 per year, plus room and board, books, and living expenses. On my factory salary, even with overtime, that seemed impossible. But I was determined not to let money be the reason Harold couldn't pursue his dreams. I started working every available overtime shift, picking up extra hours whenever coworkers called in sick, volunteering for the least desirable assignments because they paid shift differentials. I opened a separate savings account and had money automatically transferred from each paycheck, money I never allowed myself to touch, no matter how tight things got. There were weeks when I survived on pasta and peanut butter sandwiches so that Harold's college fund could grow by another $200. There were months when I wore the same 3 work uniforms over and over because I couldn't afford to replace them. I drove a 15-year-old car that broke down regularly because I couldn't justify the expense of something newer when that money could go toward Harold's education. When Harold graduated high school with a 3.7 GPA and got accepted to the state university's computer science program, I had saved $31,000. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was enough to get him started without massive student loans. I'll never forget the look on his face when I handed him the bank statements, showing what we'd accumulated for his education. "Mom, how did you save all this? We've never had extra money." "We had extra love," I told him, "and love finds a way to provide." College brought new sacrifices. Harold's expenses were higher than I'd anticipated. Textbooks alone cost $800 per semester, and there were lab fees, technology fees, parking passes, and 100 other costs that added up quickly. I took on additional weekend shifts, working 7 days a week during his sophomore and junior years to keep up with his expenses. When Harold graduated with his degree and got his first job at the hospital, making $52,000 a year right out of college, I felt like everything I'd sacrificed had been worth it. My son had broken the cycle of limited opportunities. He'd never have to choose between medicine and electricity, never have to work multiple jobs just to survive, never have to wonder if education was a luxury he couldn't afford. And when he met Delilah, I was genuinely happy for him. She was educated, professionally successful, and seemed to appreciate Harold's intelligence and character. When they got serious and started talking about marriage, I wanted to give them the best possible start to their life together. The $47,000 I gave them for their house down payment represented 12 years of careful saving after Harold graduated college. Every dollar of it came from overtime shifts, from saying no to small luxuries, from choosing to repair things instead of replacing them. I'd planned to use that money to eventually buy a small place of my own, maybe a little cottage where I could finally rest after decades of working myself to the bone. But Harold's happiness mattered more to me than my own comfort. When I saw how excited he and Delilah were about that beautiful house in Maplewood Heights, how they talked about filling it with children and creating the kind of stable family life Harold had never had growing up, I didn't hesitate to empty my savings account. "This is for your future," I told them at the closing, "for the family you're going to build together." Delilah had hugged me with tears in her eyes that day. "I promise we'll take care of you the way you've taken care of Harold," she'd whispered. "You'll always have a place in our family." Now, as I sat in the bedroom of the house I'd helped them buy, listening to my daughter-in-law plot my removal like I was an unwanted tenant, those promises felt like the cruelest joke imaginable. The woman who had benefited from every sacrifice I'd made, every overtime shift I'd worked, every dollar I'd saved, was now treating me like a burden she couldn't wait to eliminate. The boy I'd raised to be kind, grateful, and loyal was allowing his wife to reduce his mother to a line item in their household budget, a liability to be managed rather than a person to be loved. But Delilah had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She assumed that because I'd always been generous with my resources, I must not have any resources left. She had no idea that my late sister Eleanor's estate was about to change everything. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in early November, 3 weeks after I'd overheard Delilah's phone conversations about getting me settled somewhere by Christmas. I'd been keeping my head down, trying to process everything I'd learned while figuring out my next move. But apparently, my quiet demeanor had emboldened Delilah to accelerate her timeline. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something I'd continued doing despite my arthritis pain because it felt like one of the few ways I could still contribute meaningfully to the household. Harold was working late, dealing with a system upgrade at the hospital, so it was just Delilah and me. She came home from the bank looking particularly pleased with herself, and I soon discovered why. "Nora, I have some exciting news," she announced, setting her briefcase down with unusual enthusiasm. "I've been working on a solution to our living situation, and I think I've found the perfect answer." I continued stirring the pot of soup I was making, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh? What kind of solution?" "Well, you know how we've been discussing senior living options? I've been doing a lot more research, and I found a place that I think could be absolutely perfect for you." She pulled out a glossy brochure from her purse. "Meadowbrook Assisted Living. It's about 40 minutes from here, in Centerville." I glanced at the brochure. The facility looked institutional despite the marketing photos of smiling elderly residents. 40 minutes is quite far from here." "That's actually one of the benefits," Delilah said quickly. "It would give you complete independence from our daily routine, which I think would be really healthy for everyone. You'd have your own space, your own schedule, and you wouldn't have to worry about household responsibilities anymore." "I don't mind household responsibilities, Delilah. This is my home too." Her smile faltered slightly. "Well, that's actually something we need to discuss. I've been thinking about this situation from a legal and financial perspective, and I've realized we need to be more clear about expectations and arrangements." She sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for me to join her. Reluctantly, I turned off the stove and sat down. a knot forming in my stomach. The thing is, Nora, while we're all grateful for your help with the down payment, this house is legally owned by Harold and me. The mortgage is in our names, the property taxes are our responsibility, and frankly, the ongoing costs of homeownership have become quite substantial. I stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. Are you suggesting that my contribution to the down payment doesn't give me any right to live here? I'm not suggesting anything hostile, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm just trying to be realistic about what's sustainable long-term. Your reduced income means you're contributing less to household expenses, and with your health issues, there are going to be additional costs we haven't factored in yet. What kind of additional costs? Delilah pulled out a folder. Apparently, she'd come prepared for this conversation. I've been researching what elder care typically costs families: home modifications for accessibility, increased insurance premiums, potential need for in-home care services, medical equipment. According to the AARP, families typically spend between $2,000 and $5,000 per month caring for an aging relative. The clinical way she laid out these projections, like I was a liability she was assessing for an insurance claim, made my blood boil. But I kept my voice level. I'm not asking you to take care of me, Delilah. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you, though? She asked, and there was something almost cruel in her tone. You can barely work full-time anymore. You're in pain most days. Last week you couldn't open a jar of pickles and had to ask Harold for help. These things don't get better at your age, Nora. They get worse. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. My arthritis is manageable with medication and physical therapy. I'm not an invalid. No one's saying you're an invalid, but let's be honest about the trajectory we're looking at. She pulled out more papers from her folder. I've calculated what it would cost for you to live independently in a senior community versus what it costs us to accommodate your needs here. The numbers don't lie. What numbers? I demanded. She spread several pages across the table. Your current financial contribution is about $2,200 per month, but your proportional share of household expenses, utilities, food, maintenance, property, taxes, comes to approximately $2,800 per month. So we're already subsidizing your living situation by $600 monthly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Subsidizing? I gave you $47,000 for this house. That was a generous gift, and we've always appreciated it. But that was 4 years ago, Nora. Since then, we've paid over $180,000 in mortgage payments plus taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Your initial contribution, while meaningful, doesn't entitle you to live here indefinitely at a loss to our household budget. The word gift hit me like a slap. I'd never called it a gift. I'd always referred to it as an investment in their future, money that helped make their dream home possible. But now Delilah was reframing it as a one-time present that carried no ongoing obligations. Furthermore, she continued, I've had to consider the impact on our future plans. Harold and I want to start a family soon. This house has 4 bedrooms, which seemed like plenty when we bought it, but one of those bedrooms is currently occupied by you. If we have children, we'll need that space. There are 3 other bedrooms besides mine, I pointed out. Yes, but we'll need a nursery and eventually separate rooms if we have more than one child. Plus, Harold really needs a home office for his consulting work. Having a senior relative living in the house just isn't compatible with the family lifestyle we're trying to build. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking with anger and hurt. So you want me out so you can have more space for hypothetical children and a home office? I want what's best for everyone involved, Delilah said, her voice taking on that fake reasonable tone I'd grown to hate. Including you. You'll be much happier in an environment designed for people your age, with activities and care available when you need it. What if I don't want to move? Her expression hardened. Well, that would be unfortunate, because Harold and I have already made the decision that this arrangement isn't working anymore. We're willing to help with the transition, but the transition is going to happen one way or another. The threat was clear, even though she'd wrapped it in diplomatic language. I was being evicted from the home I'd helped them buy, and they were framing it as doing me a favor. I need to think about this, I said, trying to buy time. Of course, but I should mention that I've already put a deposit down on a studio apartment at Meadowbrook. The move-in date is December 1st, which gives us about 3 weeks to handle the transition smoothly. I felt the room spinning around me. You put down a deposit without discussing it with me? I put down a refundable deposit to hold the space, while we finalized the decision. These places have waiting lists, and I didn't want to lose the opportunity while we debated the inevitable. Does Harold know about this? Harold and I discussed it, and he agreed that this is probably the best solution for everyone. He's concerned about your health and wants to make sure you're in a place where you can get proper care if you need it. I couldn't believe that Harold, my Harold, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, had agreed to ship me off to some institutional facility without even talking to me about it. But when I thought about how he'd been acting lately, how he'd become more distant and less engaged with household conversations, I realized that Delilah had probably been working on him for weeks, just like she'd planned. The December 1st move-in date is actually perfect timing, Delilah continued, consulting her notes. It gives us time to convert your room into Harold's office before the holidays, and you'll be settled in your new place in time for all the Christmas activities they have planned at Meadowbrook. The casual way she discussed dismantling my life, like she was rearranging furniture, was the final straw. And what if I refused to go? Delilah's mask finally slipped completely. Then you'll be making things very difficult for Harold, and I don't think you want to do that to your son. He's already stressed about this situation, and forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother would be incredibly selfish. There it was, the ultimatum I'd been dreading. Accept exile, or be blamed for destroying Harold's marriage. Besides, she added, standing up and gathering her papers, legally speaking, you don't have much choice. This is our house, and we have the right to decide who lives here. I'd prefer to handle this amicably, but if necessary, we can make it official. As she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and my world crashing down around me, I realized that the woman I'd welcomed into my family had been planning this betrayal for months. Every kind word, every expression of gratitude, every promise about taking care of me, it had all been lies designed to keep me compliant until she was ready to dispose of me. But what Delilah didn't know was that I'd been planning too. And unlike her calculated cruelty, my preparations were about to pay off in ways she could never imagine. That night, after Delilah's devastating ultimatum, I sat in my bedroom staring at the Meadowbrook assisted living brochure she'd left on my nightstand like a death sentence. The cheerful photos of elderly residents playing cards and tending small gardens felt like mockery, staged happiness to mask the reality of being warehoused because you were no longer useful to your family. But as I sat there in the darkness, something shifted inside me. The helpless despair I'd felt during dinner began transforming into something harder, more focused. Delilah had made a critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that because I'd always been generous and self-sacrificing, I must be weak and without resources. She had no idea what was coming. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call that changed everything, though I'd kept the news to myself while processing the implications. My sister Eleanor had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at her home, in Phoenix. We hadn't been particularly close in recent years. Eleanor had moved to Arizona 15 years ago for her husband's job, and we'd drifted apart the way siblings sometimes do when geography and busy lives interfere with good intentions. But Eleanor had never forgotten how I'd sacrificed my own comfort to help Harold succeed. During our occasional phone calls, I'd mentioned my contributions to his college education, the down payment I'd provided for his house, and the way I'd continued supporting his household even as my own retirement savings remained non-existent. Nora, "You've given that boy everything," she'd said during our last conversation. "When are you going to start taking care of yourself?" What I didn't know was that Eleanor had been taking care of me in ways I never imagined. Her husband Frank had been a successful commercial real estate developer, and when he passed away, 5 years earlier, Eleanor inherited a substantial portfolio. She'd lived modestly, invested wisely, and when her own time came, she'd left everything to the sister who had spent her entire adult life putting others first. The estate attorney, Mr. Coleman, had called me on a Tuesday afternoon in August. "Mrs. Bailey, I'm calling regarding your sister Eleanor's will. You've been named as the sole beneficiary of her estate. I'd expected maybe a few $1,000s, perhaps some family jewelry or mementos. I certainly hadn't expected what Mr. Coleman told me next. The total value of the estate after taxes and final expenses comes to approximately $847,000. This includes liquid assets, investment accounts, and the proceeds from the sale of her Arizona property." I'd nearly dropped the phone. $847,000. More money than I'd earned in my entire working life. More than I'd ever dreamed of having. Eleanor had left me financial independence and the freedom to make choices, based on what I wanted, not what I could afford. But I'd kept this windfall completely secret. Some instinct, perhaps honed by years of watching people's attitudes change when money was involved, told me to be careful about who knew about my changed circumstances. I'd opened new accounts at a different bank, one where Delilah had no connections through her work at First National. I'd been quietly consulting with financial advisors, learning about investment strategies and long-term planning. Now, as I sat in the bedroom that Delilah was so eager to convert into Harold's office, I realized that Eleanor's gift was about to serve a purpose she probably never intended. My sister had given me the power to fight back. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, but my emotional state made focusing on factory machinery dangerous. Instead, I drove to downtown Brookfield and walked into the offices of Peterson & Associates, the law firm that had handled Eleanor's estate. I'd done enough research to know that I needed legal advice, and I wanted it from someone who already understood my financial situation. Mr. Coleman was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of handling delicate family situations. When I explained what was happening with Harold and Delilah, his expression grew increasingly concerned. "Mrs. Bailey, what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse," he said after I'd finished my story. "The fact that you contributed substantially to their home purchase creates certain legal protections, regardless of whose name is on the deed. But Delilah says I have no legal rights because the house is in their names. That's not entirely accurate. In cases where an elderly person has made substantial financial contributions to a property with the understanding that they would have ongoing residence rights, courts have recognized various forms of legal protection. We'd need to establish the nature of your contribution and the circumstances under which it was made." I pulled out the folder I'd brought with me, containing bank records, canceled checks, and email correspondence from the time of the house purchase. "I have documentation of the down payment, and I can show that I've been contributing to household expenses consistently for 4 years." Mr. Coleman reviewed the documents carefully. "This is very helpful. The pattern of ongoing financial contribution, combined with your initial investment, suggests that you had reasonable expectation of continued residence. But there's another issue we need to address." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Are you concerned about your physical safety, or being coerced into decisions you don't want to make?" I thought about Delilah's ultimatum, her threats about making things official if I didn't comply with her timeline. "I think they're trying to pressure me into leaving before I have time to consider my options. In that case, I'd recommend we take some immediate protective steps." He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "First, I want to send a formal letter to Harold and Delilah, informing them that you have legal representation and that any decisions about your living situation must be made in consultation with counsel. This will buy us time and put them on notice that you're not the helpless victim they assume you are. What about the assisted living facility? Delilah says she's already put down a deposit. If she made financial commitments on your behalf without your consent, that's another legal issue entirely. We'll address that in our correspondence as well. Over the next hour, Mr. Coleman outlined a comprehensive strategy. We would document everything: Delilah's threats, the financial pressure, any attempts to coerce me into decisions I didn't want to make. He recommended that I start recording conversations when possible, particularly if they became threatening or abusive. The key is to build a clear record of their behavior while we explore your legal options, he explained. Pennsylvania law provides various protections for elderly individuals, especially when there's evidence of financial exploitation or coercion. I left his office feeling more empowered than I had in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't reacting to Delilah's plans. I was making plans of my own. That afternoon, I made several more strategic moves. I opened a safety deposit box at my new bank and stored copies of all my important documents, including Eleanor's will, the estate settlement papers, and my new account information. I also purchased a small digital recording device, the kind that could easily be concealed in a pocket or purse. Most importantly, I began documenting everything. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, every threat Delilah had made, every instance where she'd treated me like a burden rather than a family member. I created a timeline of events, starting with my arthritis diagnosis and ending with her ultimatum about the December move-out date. When Harold came home from work that evening, I was ready. Delilah was still at the bank, working late on some loan applications, so it was just the two of us in the kitchen. I'd prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes and green beans, partly as a gesture of love and partly as a way to create a comfortable setting for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. "Harold, I need to talk to you about something important," I said as we sat down to eat. He looked up from his plate, and for a moment I saw the little boy I'd raised, the child who used to tell me everything about his day and ask for my advice about his problems. "What's up, Mom?" "Delilah told me that you two have decided I need to move to an assisted living facility. She says you've already discussed it and agreed that it's the best solution." Harold's expression became uncomfortable, and he set down his fork. "Mom, it's not that we don't want you here. It's just, things have gotten complicated." "Complicated how?" He struggled to find the words, and I could see Delilah's influence in his rehearsed-sounding response. "With your health issues and the reduced income, we're worried about what happens if you need more care in the future. Maybe it would be better if you were somewhere with professional staff and medical support." "Harold, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you got pneumonia?" The question caught him off guard. "I guess so. Why?" "Do you remember how I took care of you? How I stayed home from work for a week, sleeping in the chair next to your bed, making sure you took your medicine and had everything you needed?" "Yeah, I remember. You were great, Mom. And when you were in college and you called me at 2 a.m. because you were stressed about finals, do you remember what I told you? Do you remember what I told you?" Harold's voice grew quiet. "You said that family takes care of family no matter what." I reached across the table and took his hand. "That's right. Family takes care of family. So I need you to explain to me why, now that I'm the one who might need some care, the solution is to send me away to live with strangers." For a moment, I saw conflict in his eyes, the remnant of the values I'd tried to instill in him warring with whatever arguments Delilah had been making. But before he could respond, we heard her car in the driveway. "We'll talk more later," I said quietly, squeezing his hand. "But I want you to think about something. I want you to think about whether the woman you married is the kind of person who builds families up or tears them apart." As Delilah's key turned in the front door, I activated the recording device in my pocket. Phase 2 of my plan was about to begin, and this time, I would have evidence of every word. The recording device had been in my pocket for 3 days before I caught the conversation that would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Harold had gone to help his friend Jason move into a new apartment. Delilah thought I was upstairs napping, something I'd been doing more often lately, partly because of my arthritis pain, and partly because it gave me opportunities to overhear conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. But this time, I was very much awake and very deliberately positioned at the top of the stairs when Delilah's sister Monica came over for their weekly gossip session. Monica lived 2 towns over and worked as a paralegal, which made her Delilah's go-to person for what she considered legal advice. I'd always found Monica to be even more calculating than Delilah, if that was possible. "So how's Operation Grandma Relocation going?" Monica asked as they settled into the living room with their wine glasses. Delilah laughed at her sister's cruel joke. "Better than expected, actually. I think she's finally starting to accept reality." Good. I was worried. She might dig in her heels and make things difficult. "Oh, she tried that at first, but I've been very strategic about how I've handled this. The key is making her think that moving out is actually what's best for her." I pressed the record button on my device and held my breath. "How did you manage that?" Monica asked. "Well, first I did my research. I found the cheapest decent facility I could. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe. Then I started planting seeds about how she'd be happier around people her own age. How she wouldn't have to worry about household responsibilities, all that nonsense. And she bought it? Not initially. But then I started documenting everything. Her limitations, her reduced financial contribution, her impact on our daily life. I made it look like a business decision rather than a personal one." Monica's voice carried a note of admiration. "That's brilliant. Make it about numbers instead of emotions." "Exactly. And the beautiful part is that I'm not technically lying about anything. Her arthritis has reduced her earning capacity. She does require more accommodation than she used to. The financial calculations I showed her are accurate. She's costing us more than she's contributing." "What about Harold? Is he on board?" There was a pause, and I could picture Delilah taking a sip of wine before answering. "Harold required more finesse. He still has these guilt feelings about his mother's sacrifices when he was younger. So I had to reframe the situation for him." "How so?" "I convinced him that keeping her here would actually be cruel to her. I painted a picture of her becoming increasingly isolated and dependent, unable to participate in activities or maintain friendships with people her own age. I made him see her future here as lonely and limiting. And that worked? Like a charm. Harold's always been susceptible to arguments about doing the right thing. Once I convinced him that moving his mother to assisted living was actually the compassionate choice, he came around completely. I felt sick listening to how coldly Delilah had manipulated my son's genuine concern for my well-being. "But what about the money she gave you for the house?" Monica asked. "Doesn't that complicate things legally?" "I had my lawyer look into that," Delilah replied, and my blood ran cold. Since it was structured as a gift rather than a loan, and since our names are the only ones on the deed, she has no legal claim to ongoing residence rights. The money she gave us was substantial, but it was a one-time contribution 4 years ago. We've paid far more than that in mortgage payments and maintenance since then. So she can't claim any ownership interest? None whatsoever. And even if she tried to make trouble, what's she going to do? Hire a lawyer with what money? She's living paycheck to paycheck, especially now with the reduced hours. They both laughed at this, and I had to grip the stair railing to keep from rushing down there and confronting them immediately. "You know what the best part is?" Delilah continued. "She's actually going to be grateful in the long run. These senior communities have activities, social interaction, medical support, things she can't get living here. In 5 years, she'll probably thank me for forcing her to make this move." "You're probably right. Plus, think about what this does for your marriage. No more tiptoeing around the live-in mother-in-law. No more awkward dinners with Harold's childhood stories. You'll finally have your house to yourselves. God, yes. Do you know how long it's been since Harold and I could have a normal conversation without worrying about including her or hurting her feelings? And forget about intimacy. It's hard to feel romantic when you know your mother-in-law is down the hall. The casual way they discussed erasing me from Harold's life was breathtaking in its cruelty. "When's the move-out date?" Monica asked. "December 1st. I've already paid the deposit and filled out all the paperwork." I told her it was refundable, but actually it's not. I figured if she knew that, she might panic and try to back out. Smart. So you've basically trapped her. I've created a situation where cooperation is her only realistic option. The alternative would be Harold having to choose between his wife and his mother, and let's face it, that's not really a choice at all. Especially not after everything you've done to build your case, Monica agreed. You've been documenting her decline, showing the financial burden, making Harold see the practical benefits of the move. Even if she wanted to fight it, what argument could she make? Exactly. And here's the thing that really seals the deal. I found out something interesting about assisted living costs versus home care costs. If she stays here and her condition worsens, we could be looking at thousands per month in care expenses. The assisted living facility has all those services included in the monthly fee. So you're actually saving money by moving her out? In the long term, absolutely. Plus, we get our house back, our privacy back, and our marriage back. It's win-win for everyone who matters. The phrase, everyone who matters, hit me like a physical blow. I apparently didn't matter in the equation at all. I have to ask, Monica said, lowering her voice slightly. Do you feel bad about any of this? I mean, she did help you guys buy the house. Look, I'm grateful for what she did, but that doesn't mean I owe her the rest of my life. She made her choices, working factory jobs, never remarrying, pouring everything into Harold. Those were her decisions, and she can't expect me to live with the consequences forever. That's very mature of you, Monica replied. A lot of people would let guilt cloud their judgment. I refuse to let someone else's poor planning become my problem. She had 30 years to save for retirement, to build a life outside of Harold. She chose not to do that, and now she's facing the natural consequences of those choices. The recording device in my pocket felt hot against my palm as I listened to Delilah reduce my lifetime of sacrifice to poor planning. Every overtime shift I'd worked to pay for Harold's education, every dollar I'd saved to give him opportunities I'd never had, every sacrifice I'd made to ensure his success, all of it dismissed as bad decision-making that didn't deserve consideration. Besides, Delilah continued, Harold and I are at a crucial point in our lives. We want to start a family. We're both up for promotions at work, and we need to focus on building our future. We can't do that effectively if we're constantly managing the needs of an aging relative. Absolutely. You have to prioritize your own family's needs. That's exactly how I see it. Harold is my family now. His mother had her time to be the priority in his life, and now it's my turn. I'd heard enough. My hands were shaking as I crept back to my bedroom, the recording device still running in my pocket. The casual cruelty of their conversation, the calculated way Delilah had manipulated the situation, the complete dismissal of my contributions and my worth. It was almost too much to process. But as I sat on my bed, replaying what I'd just heard, I felt something crystallize inside me. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being joined by something else. Cold, determined anger. Delilah thought she had all the advantages, all the power, all the control. She thought I was a helpless old woman with no resources and no options. She was about to discover just how wrong she was. That evening, I called Mr. Coleman and left a voicemail. I have some new evidence we need to discuss, I said simply. And I think it's time to move to the next phase of our strategy. The my game was changing, and Delilah didn't even know she was no longer the only one playing it. playing it. The confrontation I'd been building toward finally came on a Tuesday evening in mid-November, exactly 2 weeks before Delilah's December 1st deadline. I'd spent the previous week working with Mr. Coleman to prepare what he called our full disclosure strategy. The recording from Delilah and Monica's conversation had given us exactly the evidence we needed to demonstrate the calculated nature of her campaign against me. But I wanted more than just legal protection. I wanted Harold to see his wife's true character with his own eyes. So when Delilah announced that her parents were coming for dinner to discuss some family matters, I knew this was my moment. She'd been building towards some kind of formal family meeting where everyone would pressure me to accept the assisted living arrangement, and I decided to let her walk right into my trap. Dr. and Mrs. Peterson, Delilah's parents, arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, dressed in their usual formal attire that seemed designed to intimidate. Dr. Peterson was a retired economics professor who had always treated me with polite condescension, while Mrs. Peterson was a former school principal who specialized in making people feel small. They'd never approved of Harold's limited educational background and had barely tolerated me as his mother. "Nora," Dr. Peterson said as they settled into the living room, "Delilah tells us you're facing some difficult decisions about your living situation." I smiled pleasantly, my hand resting on the recording device in my cardigan pocket. "Actually, I've already made my decision, but I'm curious to hear what Delilah has told you about the situation." Delilah shot me a sharp look, clearly not expecting me to take control of the conversation. "I've explained that with your health issues and reduced income, we all need to think about what's best for your long-term care and well-being." "How thoughtful of you," I replied. "And what exactly did you tell your parents about my financial situation?" Harold looked uncomfortable with the tension in the room. "Mom, maybe we should just—" "No, Harold, I think it's important that everyone understands the complete picture." I turned back to Dr. Peterson. "Delilah, why don't you explain to your father exactly how much I contribute to this household each month?" "Well, with your reduced hours, it's approximately $2,200, Delilah said carefully. "And how much did I contribute to the down payment on this house?" "That was a generous gift of $47,000, she replied, emphasizing the word gift. Interesting choice of words. "Harold, when I gave you that money, did I call it a gift or an investment in your future?" Harold shifted uncomfortably. "You said it was an investment, Mom. You said you wanted to help us build something together," Mrs. Peterson interjected. "Well, regardless of how it was characterized at the time, the legal reality is that the house belongs to Harold and Delilah." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "The legal reality is very important, which is why I've been working with my attorney to understand all the legal realities of this situation." The room went dead silent. Delilah's face went pale. "Your attorney?" "Yes, Mr. Coleman from Peterson and Associates. He's been very educational about elder law and financial exploitation statutes. Fascinating stuff, really." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my notes app. "For instance, did you know that in Pennsylvania, it's illegal to coerce an elderly person into housing decisions through threats or financial manipulation?" Dr. Peterson frowned. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nora? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts." I looked directly at Delilah. "Would you like to tell your parents about our conversation 3 weeks ago, where you informed me that this arrangement isn't working anymore and that the transition was going to happen one way or another? Or should I play the recording?" Delilah's eyes went wide with shock and fear. "You recorded our conversation?" "I've recorded several conversations, actually, including some very interesting ones you've had with other people." I pulled out the small recording device and set it on the coffee table. "Would anyone like to hear what you and Monica discussed last Sunday while I was supposedly napping?" "You can't record people without their permission," Mrs. Peterson protested. "Actually, Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state," I replied calmly. "As long as one person in the conversation consents to recording, in this case me, It's perfectly legal. Mr. Coleman confirmed that for me. Harold was staring at his wife with growing confusion and concern. Delilah, what is she talking about? What recordings? I pressed play on the device, and Delilah's voice filled the room. The key is making her think that moving out is actually what's best for her. The color drained from Harold's face as he listened to his wife explaining her manipulation tactics, laughing about Operation Grandma Relocation, and dismissing his mother's contributions as poor planning. When the recording reached the part where Delilah said his mother had her time to be the priority, and now it was my turn, Harold stood up abruptly. "Turn it off," he said quietly. "Harold, I can explain." Delilah started, but he held up his hand. "Turn it off, Mom." He looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before, cold disappointment mixed with disgust. "I've heard enough." Dr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, this is certainly illuminating." "Oh, we're just getting started," I said, pulling out a folder of documents. "Would you like to see the assisted living contract that Delilah signed on my behalf? The one with the non-refundable deposit that she told me was refundable." I spread the papers across the coffee table. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to review the legal analysis Mr. Coleman prepared regarding my residence rights based on my substantial financial contributions to this property." Mrs. Peterson was studying the documents with obvious concern. As a former educator, she knew fraud when she saw it. "Delilah, did you really sign legal documents on Nora's behalf without her knowledge?" "I was trying to secure her a place before the waiting list got too long," Delilah said weakly. "I thought I was helping." "By lying about the deposit terms?" I asked. "By telling me it was refundable when you knew it wasn't?" Harold was pacing, now running his hands through his hair. "I can't believe this. Delilah, you told me Mom was on board with the move. You said she just needed time to adjust to the idea." She did need time. "And she was never going to agree willingly because she's too stubborn to see what's best for her." "What's best for her, or what's best for you?" Harold's voice was rising. "Because from what I just heard, this was never about Mom's well-being. This was about getting her out of your way." Dr. Peterson stood up, clearly wanting to distance himself from his daughter's behavior. "I think we should go, Margaret. This family needs to work through some issues privately." "Actually," I said, standing as well, "there's one more thing everyone should know before you leave." I pulled out the bank statement I'd been saving for this moment. The reason I've been so calm about all of this, the reason I haven't been panicking about being forced into a substandard nursing home, is that my financial situation changed significantly 3 months ago. I handed the statement to Harold, watching his eyes widen as he processed the numbers. "My sister Eleanor passed away and left me her entire estate, $847,000 to be exact." The silence in the room was deafening. Delilah looked like she was about to be sick. "So you see," I continued, "I don't need anyone to take care of me financially. I don't need to accept substandard housing because it's all I can afford. And I certainly don't need to tolerate being treated like a burden by people who benefited from my generosity when it suited them." Harold sank back into his chair, staring at the bank statement. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing left to offer." I looked at Delilah, whose face had gone from pale to gray. "And now I know." Dr. Peterson was shaking his head sadly. "Delilah, what have you done?" She started, then stopped, apparently realizing that there was no explanation that could justify her behavior now that everyone knew I had the resources to fight back. "Here's what's going to happen," I announced, my voice steady and calm. "I'm not moving to any assisted living facility. This is my home, which I helped purchase with my life savings, and where I've contributed faithfully for 4 years. If anyone has a problem with that arrangement, they're welcome to make other living arrangements themselves." Harold was still staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. "How could you do this to her?" How could you do this? To us? Harold, you have to understand, Delilah began, but I cut her off. No, I think Harold understands perfectly now. The question is, what are you going to do about it? As Dr. and Mrs. Peterson gathered their things and hurried toward the door, clearly wanting no part of the disaster their daughter had created, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. The truth was finally out. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in that room now understood exactly who the real villain in this story had been all along. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one more card to play, and it was going to ensure that Delilah never again underestimated the quiet woman she'd tried so hard to discard. The week following my revelation was unlike anything I could have anticipated. The comfortable routine that had defined our household for 4 years completely disintegrated, replaced by a tension so thick you could practically see it hanging in the air. Harold barely spoke to Delilah, spending most evenings in the garage tinkering with his workbench or staying late at the hospital for system maintenance that I suspected was more about avoiding home than actual work requirements. Delilah, for her part, seemed to be in a state of shock. The confident, calculating woman who had orchestrated my removal with such precision had been replaced by someone who jumped every time the phone rang and couldn't seem to meet anyone's eyes during the few conversations we were forced to have. But I wasn't content to simply let the natural consequences of her behavior play out. She had tried to destroy my life with methodical cruelty, and I wanted her to understand exactly what that felt like. My first move was to contact Meadowbrook Assisted Living. When I called to discuss the unauthorized contract Delilah had signed, on my behalf, the administrator was immediately concerned. "Ma'am, we take issues of fraudulent documentation very seriously," she said after I explained the situation. "No one should be signing admission contracts without the resident's explicit consent and presence." I'm glad to hear that. I have recordings and documentation proving that this was done without my knowledge, using false information about my financial situation and medical needs. We'll need to review this immediately. Frankly, if what you're describing is accurate, we'll need to involve our legal department and possibly report this to the appropriate authorities. Within 2 days, Delilah received a registered letter from Meadowbrook's legal team, informing her that they were investigating potential fraud in connection with my admission contract. The letter also mentioned that they would be forwarding their findings to the Pennsylvania Department of Health, which oversees assisted living facilities and takes unauthorized placements very seriously. When Harold saw the letter, his face went ashen. "Delilah, they're talking about fraud charges, actual criminal charges." "It wasn't fraud," she protested weakly. "I was trying to help her." "By forging her signature on legal documents?" Harold's voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "By lying about her mental capacity and financial situation? What exactly did you tell them to get them to accept the contract?" Delilah's silence was answer enough. I later learned from Mr. Coleman that she had claimed I was showing signs of dementia and was unable to make decisions for myself. A lie that could have had devastating consequences for my legal rights and future independence. But the Meadowbrook investigation was just the beginning. My next call was to First National Bank, where Delilah worked as a senior loan officer. I requested a meeting with the branch manager, Mr. Stevens, whom I'd met several times at community events over the years. "Mrs. Bailey, how can I help you? Today?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit in his office. "I'm here to discuss a concerning pattern of behavior involving one of your employees," I said, pulling out my folder of documentation. "I believe someone with access to financial information and legal knowledge has been engaged in what my attorney calls financial elder abuse." Mr. Stevens's expression grew serious as I laid out the evidence. The recordings, the fraudulent contracts, the attempts to coerce me into financial decisions based on false information about my resources and rights. "This is very troubling, Mrs. Bailey. If an employee of this bank has been using their position or knowledge to exploit vulnerable individuals, That's a serious violation of our ethical standards and potentially our regulatory compliance. Thought you should be aware, given that this person handles sensitive financial information for elderly clients on a daily basis. If she's willing to manipulate and deceive her own family members, I have to wonder what she might be capable of, with strangers who trust her professional guidance. Within a week, Delilah was called into a formal meeting with HR and the bank's compliance department. While I wasn't privy to the details of that meeting, the results spoke for themselves. Delilah was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into her conduct, both professional and personal. "They're questioning everything," she told Harold one evening, not knowing I was listening from the kitchen. "Every loan I've processed, every client interaction, every decision I've made. They're treating me like a criminal." "Maybe because you acted like one," Harold replied flatly. But the professional consequences were only part of what Delilah was facing. Word of the situation had begun to spread through our social circles, partly because Dr. and Mrs. Peterson had been so mortified by their daughter's behavior that they'd felt compelled to apologize to several mutual acquaintances. In a town the size of Brookfield, news travels fast, especially when it involves respected community members and shocking family betrayals. Monica, Delilah's sister and partner in cruelty, suddenly found herself dealing with her own problems. It turned out that some of the legal advice she'd given Delilah about my rights and options had been not just wrong, but potentially actionable. When Mr. Coleman sent a letter to the law firm where Monica worked as a paralegal, detailing her role in what he termed a conspiracy to defraud an elderly person of her legal rights, Monica's employer took immediate action. "Paralegals are held to strict ethical standards," Mr. Coleman explained to me. "They can't provide legal advice, and they certainly can't participate in schemes to circumvent someone's legal protections. Monica could lose her certification over this." The social consequences were perhaps the most devastating for Delilah. The women's groups she'd been so proud to be part of, the Junior League, the Hospital Auxiliary, the Country Club Committee, began distancing themselves from her as word spread about her treatment of her elderly mother-in-law. In a community that prized family values and caring for elders, Delilah's behavior was seen as particularly shocking. I learned about this from my friend Margaret Wilson, who ran the Church Ladies Auxiliary that Delilah had recently joined. "Nora, I have to tell you, we're all just horrified by what we've heard," Margaret said during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "To think that she was plotting to warehouse you in some cheap facility while sitting in our meetings talking about Christian charity and family values, it's just unconscionable." "I appreciate your support, Margaret. It's been a difficult time." "Well, I want you to know that Delilah is no longer welcome in our group. We can't have someone who treats her own family with such calculated cruelty representing our organization in the community." The pattern repeated itself across Delilah's social and professional networks. The carefully cultivated image she'd built as a successful, caring young professional crumbled as people learned the truth about her character. Invitations stopped coming, social media posts went unacknowledged, and the networking connections she'd worked so hard to develop began avoiding her calls. Harold, meanwhile, was struggling with his own reckoning. The son I'd raised to value loyalty, kindness, and family had to confront the reality that he'd married someone whose values were the complete opposite of everything I'd tried to teach him. "Mom, I don't know how to fix this," he told me one evening as we sat in the kitchen. Something that had become our routine since Delilah started working late most nights, probably to avoid the tension at home. "Some things can't be fixed, Harold. They can only be learned from. I feel like I failed you. I should have seen what she was doing, should have protected you from her. You're not responsible for your wife's choices, son, but you are responsible for your own choices going forward." It was during one of these conversations that Harold made the decision that would complete Delilah's downfall. He'd been consulting with his own attorney about the implications of his wife's behavior, and what he learned had shaken him to his core. "Mom, my lawyer says that Delilah's actions could have put both of us at legal risk. If you had decided to Press charges for elder abuse or fraud. I could have been implicated as a co-conspirator, even though I didn't know what she was really doing. I never intended to involve you in any legal action, Harold. I know that. But the fact that she put me in that position, that she was willing to risk my reputation and career for her convenience, I can't live with someone like that. The next morning, Harold served Delilah with divorce papers. The woman who had been so confident about getting her house back and her marriage back suddenly found herself facing the loss of both. The woman who had calculated every angle of removing me from their lives had failed to calculate the most important factor of all, that actions have consequences, and cruelty eventually comes back to destroy the person who practices it. But even as I watched Delilah's carefully constructed life fall apart around her, I felt no satisfaction in her pain. I had learned something important about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice restores balance and protects the innocent, while revenge only perpetuates the cycle of harm. Delilah had chosen her path, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As for me, I was finally ready to start living for myself. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of my beautiful home in Westfield Gardens, the upscale community I'd purchased with Eleanor's inheritance, watching the sunrise paint the lake beyond my backyard in shades of gold and pink. The house was everything I'd ever dreamed of. A charming colonial with wraparound porches, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a master suite that overlooked the water. But more than the physical beauty of my surroundings, what filled me with contentment was the profound sense of peace that had settled into my life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few months after Delilah's world collapsed had been intense and emotionally draining, even though I was finally free from her manipulation. Harold's divorce proceedings were messy and public, with Delilah fighting bitterly for assets she had no legal claim to. She'd tried to argue that she deserved half of our house in Maplewood Heights, conveniently forgetting that my $47,000 down payment and 4 years of contributions had made that house possible. Mr. Coleman had been masterful in court, presenting the evidence of Delilah's fraudulent behavior, her attempts to coerce me into unwanted housing arrangements, and her calculated campaign to isolate me from my own son. The judge had been particularly disturbed by the recordings of her conversations with Monica, especially the parts where they'd laughed about Operation Grandma Relocation and discussed me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a human, being deserving of respect. Mrs. Thompson, the judge had said during the final hearing, using Delilah's maiden name since she'd reverted to it, your behavior toward Mrs. Bailey represents some of the most callous elder abuse I've encountered. In my 20 years on this bench, the calculated nature of your manipulation, combined with your professional position of trust in the banking industry, makes your actions particularly egregious. Delilah had received nothing in the divorce settlement except her personal belongings and her car. Harold kept the Maplewood Heights house, which he'd eventually sold to move closer to me in Westfield Gardens. The proceeds from that sale had allowed him to purchase a lovely townhouse just 10 minutes from my new home, close enough that we could see each other regularly, but far enough that we each maintained our independence. The professional consequences for Delilah had been swift and devastating. Word of her behavior had spread throughout the banking community, making it impossible for her to find work in her chosen field. The last I'd heard, she'd moved to Cleveland and was working as a customer service representative for an insurance company, a far cry from the prestigious loan officer position she'd held at First National Bank. Monica had faced similar professional ruin. The Pennsylvania Bar Association had revoked her paralegal certification, and her former employer had been so concerned about potential liability that they'd reported her conduct to every law firm in the region. She'd eventually left the state, entirely, reportedly working as a secretary in a small law office in Delaware under a different name. But I'd learned not to dwell on their fates. Revenge, I'd discovered, was far less satisfying than the simple joy of living authentically. The anger and hurt that had consumed me during those dark months had gradually transformed into something more valuable. Deep gratitude for the life, I'd been able to build and the relationships that truly mattered. Harold had flourished since his divorce. Free from Delilah's constant criticism and manipulation, he'd rediscovered his natural warmth and humor. He'd been promoted to Chief Information Officer at the Regional Medical Center, a position that not only recognized his technical skills, but also his ability to work collaboratively with others, skills that had been suppressed during his marriage, to someone who saw every interaction as a competition. "Mom," he'd told me recently, "I realize now that I'd forgotten how to be myself around Delilah. She made me feel like everything I said or did was somehow wrong or inadequate. I was walking on eggshells in my own marriage." Harold had also begun a relationship with Jennifer, a pediatric nurse he'd met through work. Jennifer was everything. Delilah wasn't kind, genuine, and genuinely interested in building connections rather than tearing them down. When Harold had introduced us 6 months earlier, Jennifer had immediately asked about my watercolor paintings, my volunteer work, and my plans for my beautiful garden. "Harold talks about you all the time," she'd said warmly. "He's so proud of how you stood up for yourself and built this amazing new life. I hope someday I can be as strong as you are." The contrast with Delilah's attitude couldn't have been more stark. Where Delilah had seen me as competition for Harold's attention, Jennifer seemed to understand that loving relationships weren't zero-sum games. She often invited me to join them for dinners or community events, and she genuinely enjoyed hearing stories about Harold's childhood and our family history. With my newfound financial security from Eleanor's inheritance, I'd been able to retire completely from Peterson textile manufacturing. After 31 years of factory work, my hands were finally free from the constant stain of fabric dyes, and my arthritis had improved significantly without the daily physical stress. I'd thrown myself into the activities I'd always dreamed of having time for: watercolor painting, gardening, reading, and volunteer work. The volunteer work had become particularly meaningful. I'd started serving as an advocate with the Brookfield Area Agency on Aging, helping other elderly individuals navigate situations involving family manipulation or financial exploitation. My experience with Delilah's tactics had given me unique insights into how abusers used emotional leverage and legal intimidation to control their victims. The thing people don't understand, I'd tell the support groups I facilitated, is that elder abuse isn't always physical. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it's simply being treated like you're invisible or inconvenient. But in every case, it's about someone deciding that your rights and dignity don't matter. I'd helped dozens of families navigate similar situations, armed with the legal knowledge I'd gained from Mr. Coleman and my own hard-won experience. There was particular satisfaction in watching other elderly individuals discover their own strength and refuse to accept treatment that diminished their worth. I'd also established the Eleanor Bailey Memorial Scholarship at Brookfield Community College, named for my late sister whose generosity had made my independence possible. The scholarship provided tuition assistance and emergency support for single mothers pursuing education while raising children, women facing the same struggles I'd encountered when Harold was young. No one should have to choose between their child's future and their own survival, I'd explained when establishing the fund. Each semester, I met with the scholarship recipients, sharing meals and stories, offering encouragement and practical advice. Watching these women graduate and build better lives for themselves and their children reminded me daily why Eleanor's gift had been so precious. My new home in Westfield Gardens had become a haven of peace and creativity. The sunroom I'd converted into an art studio was filled with canvases depicting the changing seasons around the lake, the wildlife that visited my garden, and the faces of people who'd touched my life. My paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, created in moments of pure joy without worrying about anyone else's judgment or approval. The guest bedroom was frequently occupied by Harold and Jennifer, or by friends from my volunteer work, or by scholarship recipients who needed a quiet place to study. The large kitchen where I'd once prepared meals while listening to Delilah's complaints was now the heart of a home filled with laughter, meaningful conversations, and genuine connections. Most importantly, I'd learned to value myself the way I deserved to be valued. The generous woman who had sacrificed her retirement savings for her son's happiness had learned to balance giving with receiving. The quiet mother who had swallowed her pride for decades had found her voice and learned to use it. The aging dependent that Delilah had tried to warehouse had discovered her own power and refused to let anyone diminish it again. On this particular morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched a family of geese glide across the lake, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that terrible evening when Delilah had delivered her ultimatum. The woman who had tried to reduce me to a burdensome obligation had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: the motivation to finally live for myself. Harold would be coming for dinner tonight, probably with Jennifer, and we'd sit on the back porch watching the sunset while planning our upcoming trip to visit Eleanor's grave in Arizona. Sarah from the scholarship program had called yesterday to tell me about her new job as a registered nurse. Mr. Coleman had invited me to speak at a legal conference about elder rights next month. My calendar was full of activities I'd chosen, relationships I treasured, and purposes that fulfilled me. At 70 years old, I was finally living the life I'd always deserved but had never dared to claim. The quiet woman Delilah had underestimated had found her strength. The generous mother she'd exploited had learned to set boundaries. The aging burden she'd tried to discard had discovered her own worth. And as I sat in my beautiful home, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and authentically chosen, I smiled at the irony. Delilah had wanted to get rid of me to start fresh with a clean slate. Instead, her cruelty had given me the opportunity to do exactly that, to wipe clean the years of self-sacrifice and self-diminishment, and to write a new story where I was the author of my own happiness. The sunrise over the lake promised another day of possibilities, another day of living life on my own terms. And after everything I'd survived and overcome, that felt like the greatest victory of all. 5 years had passed since that pivotal evening when I'd played those recordings for Harold and his in-laws, and as I prepared for what would be the most satisfying moment of my entire journey, I couldn't help but marvel at how completely my life had transformed. Today was the day I'd been quietly working toward for months. The day when Delilah would finally understand the full scope of what her cruelty had cost her, and what my quiet strength had built in return. I was getting ready for the annual Brookfield Community Excellence Awards ceremony, where I was being honored as Volunteer of the Year for my work with the Area Agency on Aging. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman Delilah had tried to warehouse in a substandard nursing home was now being recognized as a pillar of the community, celebrated for protecting other elderly individuals from the exact kind of treatment she'd tried to inflict on me. But the real reason today was special had nothing to do with the award ceremony. 3 weeks ago, I'd received a phone call that had brought everything full circle in the most unexpected way. "Mrs. Bailey, this is Amanda Richardson from Brookfield Memorial Hospital. I'm calling about a patient who's been asking for you." My heart had initially jumped with concern. Was it Harold? Jennifer? Someone from my volunteer work? The patient's name is Delilah Thompson. She's been admitted for emergency surgery, and she's listed you as her emergency contact. I'd been speechless. Delilah had listed me as her emergency contact? The woman who had tried to systematically destroy my life was reaching out to me in her moment of greatest vulnerability? "I think there must be some mistake," I'd said carefully. "Ms. Thompson and I haven't spoken in several years." She was very specific, ma'am. She said you were the only person she could trust to make medical decisions for her if she couldn't make them herself. It had taken me several hours to process this information and decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to refuse. Why should I help someone who had shown me such calculated cruelty? But another part of me, the part that had been shaped by a lifetime of caring for others, couldn't ignore someone in genuine need. I'd driven to the hospital the next morning, not knowing what to expect. What I found was a woman I barely recognized. Delilah had aged dramatically in the 5 years since our confrontation. Her once perfectly styled hair was gray and thin. Her skin had a sallow quality that spoke of poor nutrition and chronic stress. And her eyes held a defeat I'd never seen before. "Nora," she'd whispered when she saw me, tears immediately filling her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "What happened, Delilah?" I'd asked, sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her. "Bed. Appendicitis. It ruptured, and I've been in surgery twice. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive." She'd paused, staring at the ceiling. "But honestly, I'm not sure luck has anything to do with it. I've been living in a studio apartment in Cleveland, working temp jobs, barely scraping by. I don't have insurance, don't have savings, don't have anyone." The woman who had once calculated every angle of removing me from the comfortable life I'd helped build was now experiencing the exact kind of vulnerability she'd tried to force on me. "Why did you list me as your emergency contact?" I'd asked. "Because you're the only person I know who would actually care whether I lived or died," she'd replied simply. "I know I don't deserve your kindness, Nora. I know what I did to you was unforgivable. But you're the only good person I've ever really known." Over the following weeks, I'd found myself in the strange position of coordinating Delilah's care. She had no family support. Monica had cut all contact with her after losing her own career, and her parents had disowned her after learning the full extent of her behavior. She had no friends, no professional network, no safety net of any kind. The hospital's social worker had painted a grim picture. Without insurance or family support, she'll be discharged to a county facility. It's not a good situation for someone recovering from major surgery. I'd spent several sleepless nights wrestling with what to do. This was the woman who had tried to force me into the cheapest, most inadequate care she could find. This was the person who had laughed about Operation Grandma Relocation and plotted to steal my home and my dignity. By any measure of justice, she deserved to experience exactly what she'd tried to inflict on me. But that wasn't who I was, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. "I'll take care of her medical bills," I'd told the social worker. "And I'll arrange for proper recovery care." I'd used part of Eleanor's inheritance to pay for Delilah's surgery and hospital stay, and I'd arranged for her to recover in a private room at Sunrise Manor, the best assisted living facility in the region, not the warehouse-like institution she'd tried to force on me. The day of her discharge, I'd sat with Delilah in her hospital room as she prepared to leave. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "After everything I did to you? Why are you helping me?" "Because this is who I am," I'd replied simply. "You tried to make me forget that, tried to convince me I was worthless and burdensome. But I never forgot my own values, even when you forgot yours. I'm so sorry, Nora. I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. Living alone, being vulnerable, having no one who cares, it's the most terrifying thing in the world." "Yes, it is. That's why no one should have to experience it, especially not at the hands of people who are supposed to love them." Now, as I prepared for the awards ceremony, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. Harold and Jennifer had been amazed by my decision to help Delilah, and I'd had to explain to them that true strength wasn't about revenge. It was about staying true to your values, even when others had abandoned theirs. The ceremony that evening was held in the grand ballroom of the Brookfield Country Club, the same venue where Delilah had once networking with other professional women, building the image that had crumbled so spectacularly. As I walked to the podium to accept my award, I saw familiar faces throughout the crowd, people from my volunteer work, scholarship recipients who had become successful professionals, Harold and Jennifer beaming with pride from the front row. "When I began my work with the Area Agency on Aging," I said into the microphone, "I was motivated by a simple belief that every person deserves to age with dignity, respect, and the support of their community. Too often, we see elderly individuals treated as burdens rather than valued members of our families and society. I paused, thinking of Delilah recovering in her comfortable room at Sunrise Manor, probably watching this ceremony on the facility's cable system. I've learned that true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. It's about responding to cruelty with kindness, to manipulation with honesty, and to abandonment with community. The applause was warm and sustained, but more meaningful to me were the individual faces in the crowd, people whose lives had been touched by the work I'd been able to do because Eleanor's inheritance had given me the freedom to serve others. After the ceremony, as Harold and Jennifer and I sat on my back porch watching the stars reflect on the lake, Harold asked the question I'd been expecting. "Mom, do you ever regret how things turned out? Do you ever wish you'd handled things differently with Delilah?" I considered the question carefully. I regret that she chose to be the person she became. I regret that you were hurt by her betrayal. But I don't regret standing up for myself, and I don't regret helping her when she needed it. Even after everything she did to you? Especially after everything she did to me. Because the alternative would have been to become like her. Someone who sees other people's vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation rather than an opportunity for grace. As we sat in comfortable silence, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this peaceful evening. The scared, financially dependent woman who had been manipulated and threatened was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to value herself appropriately. The generous mother who had sacrificed everything without expecting gratitude had learned to balance giving with receiving. The quiet victim who had swallowed her pride had found her voice and learned to use it powerfully. Delilah had tried to write me out of my own story, to reduce me to a footnote in her pursuit of convenience and comfort. Instead, her cruelty had forced me to become the author of my own life, to write a story of resilience, dignity, and ultimately, grace. The woman who had whispered, "She's just a burden now," had learned the hard way that the quiet ones are often the strongest, that kindness is a choice that reveals character, and that true power comes not from diminishing others, but from lifting them up. As I prepared for bed that night in my beautiful home, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and authentically chosen, I smiled at the final irony. Delilah's attempts to destroy me had actually saved me, forcing me to discover strengths I never knew I had, and to build a life more meaningful than anything I'd ever imagined. The recording device that had captured her cruelty now sat in a drawer, no longer needed. The evidence of her manipulation was archived with my attorney, gathering dust. The woman who had tried to erase me from her story had become nothing more than a chapter in mine. A chapter about surviving betrayal and choosing grace over vengeance. And, as I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I knew that tomorrow would bring another day of possibilities, another day of living authentically, another day of proving that the quiet ones who endure are often the ones who ultimately triumph. The burden she'd tried to discard had become a blessing to her community. The victim she'd tried to silence had found her voice. The woman she'd underestimated had become exactly who she was always meant to be. And that, I realized as sleep overtook me, was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.